This is the 49-inch G9 OLED that I've been super excitedly waiting for ever since it was announced. Now before that, I've owned and used as my daily driver the original 49-inch G9 and then the G9 Neo, and I have racked up thousands of hours now of use across these screens. And the OLED model is pretty good. But there are a couple of issues I've experienced with this screen, which means I have to send this back. But before I get into all of that, let's run you through the specs and show you how it compares to the older versions. Now we've got the same 49-inch ultra-wide 240Hz screen that we've seen before, but that gorgeous 1000R curve has been replaced now with a less curvy 1800R curve. Now honestly, that's a real shame because I definitely like the curve of the old one. But with that said, it still runs at 5120 by 1440, and now of course with that new OLED panel. There's a full-sized HDMI 2.1, a micro HDMI 2.1, DisplayPort 1.4 ports, and a variety of USB-C ports. Though you can't use any of them for display, they're just a USB hub. The old school menu system is gone, instead replaced by the love it or hate it Samsung Tizen interface. It sports Display HDR True Black 400 with a 0.03 millisecond response time, which is pretty impressive, and AMD FreeSync Premium Pro. And from purely looking at the specs, Samsung are advertising this as primarily a gaming monitor, but I disagree. I think this makes for a great all-rounder of like productivity, content consumption, and gaming monitor. The fact is, this screen looks so much nicer than its predecessor, and it also weighs almost 3 kilograms less than the G9 Neo, which is really helpful when moving the screen around or mounting it to this monitor arm. Its thin, tapered edges just makes the whole screen look really sleek in comparison to now what's quite an old and fairly chunky build of the older model. And because of this, the screen itself actually sits a little bit further back onto the desk because the body behind it isn't as thick anymore, which does help to just, keep everything in view as you're using it. Now, one issue I do have though with this screen is their decision to go from that 1000R curve to an 1800R curve. Like having a less curvy curve in the display, it means that when you look at the far corners of this screen, it does feel a little distant, and sometimes even needing to adjust your view so that you can see or read what's in that part of the screen. Compare this to the 1000R curve, which is shaped more to wrap around you, like mimicking your natural field of view with your eyes, and it doesn't require the same amount of effort to use it. And one thing I was hoping to get better were the bezels around the edge, but they're basically the same. Like if not, they're slightly worse now because of this new reflective strip along the bottom of the screen, which if you have like a bright source of light, like a window next to you, really does reflect things. The G9 OLED still has the infinity core lighting on the back of the screen, which honestly still feels a bit pointless to me. Like you can't tell me now if it's switched on or switched off. It's just not bright enough to be of any use. Like even when you back the screen onto a wall like this, unless you're sitting in pure darkness, you're not going to be able to see the lights reflect onto the wall. So for most people who like that kind of thing, you're probably just going to switch this off, and you're going to still be looking to alternative options such as like an LED light strip behind your monitor if you want that kind of look. The good news though, let's get to that, is that at least on the side of the monitor that is important, the front side, the OLED technology looks so much better in my opinion than the previous G9. And after using the screen for a while now, I can tell you that it is an absolute pleasure to watch content on this thing. Like the blacks are like really deep blacks, colors are vibrant, and whether you're using this for productivity or for hardcore gaming sessions, I do notice the difference constantly whilst I'm using this screen. Now, the only areas where you do lose out on is in terms of peak brightness, but you are essentially giving up the brightness for better and more accurate contrast instead. And personally speaking, I ended up turning the brightness down on the G9 Neo anyway, as I typically sit in front of it for hours at a time researching and writing these videos. So for me, this has been an upgrade to keep the same brightness I was using before, but now with the richer contrast. And by the way, these videos do take quite a bit of work to research and put together. So if you are enjoying this, then I would love if you consider subscribing down below and sticking around for more videos like this one. Now, one other area which I've noticed an improvement on is the clarity, which I'm not sure if it's a placebo since both of these screens are actually 108 pixels per inch, but the OLED just looks much sharper to my eyes. Maybe because of the fact it's an OLED instead of the multiple dimming zones of the Neo, but either way, it just overall looks and feels much sharper when using it. Now, in terms of connectivity, the good news here is that there are options. There's a big HDMI, a micro HDMI, and a full-size display port. And as a Windows user, you'll likely have no problems getting the best from this screen, like 240Hz, 5120 by 1440 resolution, beautiful. It's a shame they didn't include USB-C though, because the Mac experience was not fun for me to get this thing set up. Now, most of these issues actually stem from Apple not including HDMI 2.1 on anything but their latest generation machines, as in machines they've literally launched like last month. And I did have the same issue with the previous 2 generations of the screen, which I fixed by buying one of these USB-C to DisplayPort cables, which did work just fine and let me get full resolution at 120 Hz. But for some reason, that doesn't work with the OLED model. Like, I've tested it on my M1 Mac Studio, my M2 MacBook Air, and neither of them are working using this one cable, which still works fine with the G9 Neo, by the way. Now, what eventually fixed the problem for me was having to pull out my old friend, the CowDigit dock. Now, I take a USB-C cable from the Mac Studio to the CowDigit, and then I go DisplayPort from the CowDigit to the screen itself, and that works just fine. And by fine, I mean I get a maximum 120 Hz, but still the 5120 by 1440 full resolution, which, yeah, that does suck, but that is no different to any of Samsung's previous screens. Now, interestingly, I tested an LG ultra-wide monitor recently, and that worked flawlessly at full 240 Hz, full resolution, without any of this like faffing about. So Samsung, please add USB-C, and please make sure that your screens work with Macs, because right now, they just don't. Like, not without an awful lot of adapters and cables and docks, which is totally unnecessary. Moving on though, and one more thing that the newer generation of Samsung screens come with is a remote control. Now, I personally like the idea of having a remote control instead of using like the sometimes fiddly buttons on the bottom of your screen. Now, I know for some people it's just another thing to get lost, but the introduction of a remote control does start to blur the lines somewhat of this being a computer monitor or more like a TV kind of device. And even as you go through the setup process where it walks you through signing in and registering to your account, it also asks for your region so it can serve you regional content, such as live TV broadcasts, which for the most part, people aren't going to be using this screen for since it's a computer monitor. But if anything, that is kind of just a bonus because that's just part of the Tizen OS software that comes loaded onto the screen, and more on that in just a moment. Now, this, however, is something I'd like to see improve with the remote control because I don't typically need to watch TV or access many of the smart functions like Netflix or Prime or Disney from the remote control. Instead, it would be good if there were, quick buttons to change inputs or recall presets, like change brightness, things that might be useful if you're using this as a computer monitor and not as a TV. Now, one thing that has been a massive improvement in my eyes though, and it's on many of the latest generation Samsung screens, is the new stand that comes in the box. Now, this stand doesn't really take up much desk space, and so you can still put things on it or around it without having to interfere with everything else on your desk. Now, it is a huge step up from the old triangular type mount with legs that stick out quite far into your desk, of course causing problems for those of us who use desk mats or mouse pads or just having things on or around your screen. Now, I am still a huge fan of these Ergotron monitor arms, which I'll link to down below which one I'm using, because I still prefer the whole floating above the desk kind of mid-air kind of look. It means I can actually use the space underneath these screens, such as using one of these Grove made desk shelves, which link down below if you like that and fancy checking one of those out. Now, it actually took me a while to find a monitor arm that supports the weight of one of these screens. Even though it's almost 3 kilograms lighter than it was before, it's still a very heavy screen. So yeah, my recommendation, if you are going to pick up one of these Samsung screens, then also pick up one of these Ergotron monitor arms. I just think it just finishes everything off really nice and cleanly. But getting back to the screen itself, Tizen OS, which is an upgrade from the standard monitor menu that you might be used to. Now, Tizen is a much more graphical and better looking interface and opens up features which you may or may not be interested in. The ability to watch live TV, for example, something again, I'm never really going to use the screen for because it's a monitor. Then there is support for smart things, which is a really nice bonus because now I can set up some basic automation such as turning off the screen when I leave the house to save some energy. It can also show notifications from other smart things devices, though it doesn't seem to be any way to customize where or how those notifications appear. And of course, if you're in a critical moment in the middle of a gaming session and a notification pops up to say your washing machine's finished, which covers your view of the map, well, you're probably going to want to switch that feature off anyway. It also opens up the ability to stream games from services such as Xbox Cloud Gaming or GeForce Now, but in all honesty, this is only really a feature you'd want to use if you were desperate. Mainly due to the input lag I experience between my controller and what's going on the screen. It's just not a fun experience. But again, for most people, you're going to be hooking these screens up to a gaming PC or a games console. And of course, you can get the best experience doing this as long as you're playing a game that supports the 5120 by 1440 resolution. And the games consoles, you'll get some pretty big black bars down the side. But where Tizen is an upgrade in some areas, it's also a downgrade in others. Firstly, it can be frustratingly slow to navigate these screens, which for a 2023 model shouldn't be a thing anymore. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I'm going to be returning this monitor. Now you see at the time of pre-ordering this screen, the price was £2,000, but literally a few days later, the price dropped to £1,500. That's a 25% price drop in a matter of days, and before the product even launched. And even though Samsung has a whole webpage talking about their commitment to sustainability and the environment, it seems the only way for them to honor their new pricing like this is for me to return the monitor and reorder the same screen, but at the cheaper price. So the courier is literally wasting his time tomorrow, driving all the way back to me to bring me yet another one so he can take away this one, because Samsung won't just refund the difference. Now, I reached out to them on Twitter along with a number of other people who had messaged me about the same problem. All of us have the same response. And honestly, their treatment of their, loyal customers, along with their total disregard for commitment to the environment and sustainability, would make me want to switch to another brand. But the Samsung G9 OLED is a damn good monitor, and I do see it as an upgrade from the previous version, although it does lack in a few key areas. So this screen, well, not this screen, but the G9 OLED is one I'm going to be keeping and using for the foreseeable future.